Portions of today's program are brought to you by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals like gold and silver than now. So go to legacypminvestments.com for more. Again, that's legacypminvestments.com. Markets are getting really nervous right now because the Fed has finally come around to the idea that, maybe we should cut back on this liquidity program. And maybe we ought to raise rates, given all the inflation we have seen. But is it too little too late? Probably. That's what the markets are telling us anyway. Hello, everyone. I am Trish Regan. We're going to get to everything that's going on in Ukraine as well. I have an interview coming up for you with someone who has been investigating war crimes on the ground there in Ukraine, somebody who has a lot of experience in very, very dicey areas. We're going to talk to David Falt from Preventive Diplomacy coming up. But first, let's talk a little bit about this market, because we've got investors starting to say, wait a second, what is this going to mean when the Federal Reserve actually cuts back on all that sugar, they've been sending our way? By sugar, I mean, of course, money printing to the tune of, $120 billion a month. They were buying mortgage-backed securities and treasuries, and now they're going to decline that by, $95 billion a month. So people are saying, whoa, what is that going to mean? Well, I'll tell you what it's going to mean. It's going to mean higher interest rates on treasuries, which is going to make the cost of borrowing higher, which is thereby going to reduce all that money, so to speak, in the system. I actually think this is healthy. I have argued for a long time that the Federal Reserve needed to do more. For goodness sakes, they should have started this a year ago. And instead, we had Joe Biden coming in and printing more money alongside the Fed by way of that coronavirus stimulus check. Look, I get they did what they had to do in the beginning, right? You do what you need to do in a time of crisis. And the Fed did the right thing at that point in time, but it couldn't go on forever. Because if it did, it would eventually lead to mass inflation, which is what we have seen. 10% of an increase in wholesale prices, 7.9% of an increase in consumer prices. And by the way, this was before the threat of World War III. So the Fed really effed up. I'm sorry, there's no other way to describe what they did. And now they have to channel their inner Paul Volcker, of course, being the Fed chief during those early Reagan years when they had to get inflation reined in and you saw interest rates escalate. My parents tell a great story about how they got their mortgage at 17%. That was during the Carter years, of course. Thanks, Jimmy Carter. I mean, it kind of feels like we're back there. And that's one of the things that I had mentioned early on, that we risked a return to the 1970s. And it feels like that between the energy crisis, between inflation, between the threat of stagflation, which I think is going to be very real. And now, of course, the concerns about recession, which increasingly people are starting to voice. Deutsche Bank just coming out with a note saying they anticipated the odds of recession being quite likely by the end of this year into 2023. I'd argue it could possibly come even sooner, given the increase in gas prices that we've seen, which will obviously cut down on spending, which will obviously be a drag on the economy. So investors are saying, wait a second, where do I put my money in light of all this? So I wanted to give a shout out to one of our newest sponsors, Charlie Dombeck, senior partner at Key City Capital. He's been a practicing CPA for over 30 years. He joined the show yesterday. I actually encourage you to go back and listen to that interview because Charlie, he calls himself a wealth acceleration expert. Basically, he's helping his clients to grow their wealth through strategic combinations of tax savings, diversifying their portfolios with passive investment real estate opportunities in, shall we say, landlord-friendly states. That matters these days, right? Like Texas, Florida, Tennessee. So he formed Key City Capital to help clients recover some of the dollars that they unnecessarily pay in the form of federal and state income taxes and divert that into real estate investments in order kind of to help you even out some of the market volatility that is there right now. So go to keycitycapital.com to learn more. keycitycapital.com/Trish, my name, Trish, keycitycapital.com/Trish to connect with Charlie today. Turning now to the situation in Ukraine, we have learned that the United Nations has voted to kick Russia off of its Human Rights Council. So, I mean, it's about time, right? Considering what has transpired, what we have learned. And the world is increasingly agitated, upset by this. The question is, where does it go from here? Could we have done more to prevent it? And will sanctions have an effect? So amid new word of sanctions coming from the U.S., along with Europeans looking to do something quite similar, I am joined today by David Falt from Preventive Diplomacy, founder and head of Preventive Diplomacy, which is an organization that works around the world in some pretty dicey places to see some conflict resolution. He specifically has been working at gathering evidence on war crimes there in Ukraine and joins us now. David, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Trish.
So, okay, let's start with what we saw coming out over the weekend. I mean, it's pretty horrific. You have observers there. Walk us through what you guys are seeing and where you think this is heading in terms of some of the war crimes and the evidence that you've been able to gather.
So we deployed very early on in the first days of the conflict starting, and our assumption was that we didn't think they were going to be able to take Kiev, and we estimated, or our guess was that Putin's real interest lies in the Black Sea area, so that he can connect, the Crimea Peninsula with Mariupol, Donbass, and that region, and maybe extend his slice of the country, so to speak, maybe extend it as far as to Odessa, which is a strategic port facility. The basis for that reasoning was pretty simple. We looked at how he behaved in Syria when he joined that conflict. And it was pretty obvious that, he backed the Assad regime mainly to secure his military or naval facilities in the Latakia area, so south of the Tartus Mountains. So working backwards from that, we figured, the real onslaught is going to happen down in the strategic Black Sea port areas. So we wanted to go in early. So we went in the first couple of days to see what the status of those areas were and what type of reconnaissance team and amphibious activities was going on there. We obviously had to pull out of Mariupol after 9 days of the conflict. This is an independent effort. Many groups like Human Rights Watch and others have observers and taking testimonies and statements, etc., etc. Yeah, so that was our basic.
So you've seen some pretty horrible stuff. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there. Don't forget, I mean, Russia was sort of the original fake news, right? I mean, they've got a history of this and they specialize in this. Right now, they continue to deny what's going on, but we've seen satellite images. I know that you have sources there on the ground. I mean, what do you say in response to Russia saying, no, this is true?
Well, it's pretty. This is their playbook. I think that we're in the West. We're making a few assumption mistakes. We're making the assumption that Putin is irrational. I think there's absolutely nothing irrational behind his behavior. I think this is just the way they operate. The reason we think he's irrational is that he doesn't play according to the same rules as normal functioning countries does. He has taken his country down a trajectory that is, it's very, very different from any type of normal governance. The misinformation seems to be directed in 3 different ways. Basically starting outright disinformation as active measures, as a tool of warfare, and then misdirection. So you're basically getting troll farms to incite discord and social unrest in people opposing Russia, especially the US. And then he has an internal play with censorship. So those 3 strains or nodes of misinformation is what his kind of information warfare toolkit is currently consisting of. That doesn't mean he can't expand that into outright, cyber attacks on Western interests, which is maybe something we will see later on in the conflict.
There's a lot here to talk about. I hear you on sort of their attempt to manipulate the message via troll farms online, via what they're able to control within their own country. It's not working though, right? I mean, like even you look at the polls here in the U.S. and while you see some dissonance out there with people saying, okay, well, maybe this isn't all what we think it is. I think for the most part, most Americans are pretty horrified and want to help however possible. I think that there's a lot of support for sure for Ukraine across party lines. And then when you look at what's going on in Russia, I mean, sources have told me a lot of people within Russia are very, very against this as well. So I guess I would ask you, with the number of deaths that have happened thus far to Russian soldiers, which is estimated is more than we saw in the entire 10 years they were in Afghanistan, and with the images that are now coming out for the horrors that have been committed there in Ukraine, will he start to feel the world closing in around him? In other words, not having the support of the world, not having the support of his country?
I think the support of the world is of secondary concern to him. I think that he feels disenfranchised already. And I think that has been something that's been in the making for a very long time. And I think what pivoted him into a real aggressions, I would say, and starting to build up for his own type of control of world events was the fact that he was totally cut out of coalition that air bombarded Libya and took out Gaddafi. I think that started his grievance, that he wasn't in the fold, that he wasn't read in and part of it in any way, shape, or form. And so his next play was to start backing Assad in a more direct military way with air bombardment and barrel bombs, and he had a perfect benchmark from Grozny, which he basically made a parking lot out of, and that's what we've seen in Aleppo and other places where we were also present from 2012 and forward. And Assad obviously gratefully took the support, but it's a little bit puzzling as to why he betted so much militarily on Syria, because they have the natural resources that aren't significant. So the only rational reason for him to get in the middle of that was, I think, to put down a marker to the international community to say that I can deploy my military successfully and change the trajectory of a conflict if I want to. And that's what he did. And he subsequently went in mainly with the Wagner group in Libya, but he's also been active in Central African Republic. There is reports coming out this week of Wagner and Mali's armed forces slaughtering 300 civilians in Mali. So, yeah, I think this is his way of showing that the international community can't act unilaterally without him. Mm-hmm. And now he has put everybody on notice.
Do sanctions change that? I mean, so we've got word this week. The U.S. is coming out with multiple rounds of sanctions. They refuse to allow Russia to pay its interest on its debts with U.S. dollars it held in U.S. accounts. It had already frozen, of course, all its accounts, but this was like one step more, because they were still allowing debt repayments in dollars from U.S. accounts. That's no longer. Plus, additional sanctions are being announced against members of Putin's family, 2 of his daughters, and 2 major Russian banks. How does that change the equation, or does it?
Very little. I mean, you have to assume that he anticipated a pretty hefty sanctions regime being launched against him. So he's probably prepared to some extent for that. I think our past experience with sanctions and in order to change events on the ground tells us that they are pretty toothless. I mean, Venezuela is a great example where a very comprehensive sanctions regime was put in place to effect regime change and get Maduro ousted. and that nothing happened with that. I mean, it completely died out, and they have outlived their purpose. The same with Cuba, etc., etc. And sanctions in this type of situation, when he's bombarding a country, it's not affecting his daughters, it's not affecting him that much. So I don't think it will change the trajectory of the conflict. It's also a coordination problem. The EU has sanctioned a bunch of oligarchs where the US is dragging their feet. Abramovich is one example. And all of that, the lack of coordination it's basically, it takes a bit of the bite off sanctions. So greater international cooperation would be needed.
And we don't get that. Unfortunately, you're right. Like, I've been looking back sort of historically. You can go all the way back to the 1700s. And, the Bordeaux wine trade was, quite popular, where they used to ship it to Spain and just, relabel it so it could go to the UK. It was a workaround with sanctions, similar to what probably you see in Venezuela, where the ships, it's not as convenient because they got to change flags and change paperwork in the Caribbean and then in Singapore before getting to China. But in other words, the stuff is still getting there. So workarounds are a problem, and it's why you need vigilance to enforce them. Look, David, I love the idea of being able to use sanctions well. I think that it could be very promising. And I say that because of my financial background. But I hear what you're saying. Like, we try and there's no coordination.
No, if you want bite to sanctions regime, I think you need to move into secretarial sanctions. So you really hurt the economy. You need to move into secondary sanctions. So you cut off every type of support, personnel or advisors or consultants or whatever you want, and then start revoking or prohibiting payments to universities, schools, etc., etc. So all these kind of mid-level, not the oligarchs, all the vast mid-level of millionaires and billionaires can't have their kids in European or American schools. They need to get sent home, have their student visas revoked, etc., etc. Then maybe you could get a bit of bite in it. But again,
did they do that with Venezuela? I mean, when I think about, that we put in a pretty tough sanctions into Venezuela, and I compare and contrast that with Russia, it doesn't feel like we're doing as much on Russia.
No, I think Venezuela is under a much stricter sanctions regime than Russia is, and even if it's only 4 weeks in, it's basically it's a slap in the face, these sanctions, but they're not actually that hard yet. So compared to Venezuela, Venezuela isn't committing atrocities against other people, and they're not committing atrocities in Venezuela either. And yet they are under a much tougher sanctions regime. They're not even comparable. So the notion that these sanctions announced today and in the previous week, and even if the EU and America would get 100% coordinated on this, I still have serious doubt that they would have any real impact on it. You would need to get the European Union to cut off all purchases of gas and oil for this to have some kind of...
for goodness sakes, you see what's going on and you say, well, how is it possible? What went wrong? I mean, why would Germany have been willing to do that deal for Nord Stream in the first place? Why were they delusional about Putin, or did they think that somehow that dependence on each other would actually result in more peace?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I met a Swiss professor in economics back when Nord Stream was discussed, and we met at an event, and I said I was Swedish, and we started talking. He said, "You should go back to your Minister of Foreign Affairs and tell them to shut down the Nord Stream thing ASAP, because it's going to create havoc in Europe at some point." I didn't really pay much attention to it back in the day. But the Germans have obviously made a massive miscalculation here, and maybe, as you say, they were hopeful that they could rein Russia in But if you at the same time shut them out of significant other world events, at some point you're gonna have him disenfranchised and furious in the way we now see. That this is just the result, I think, of something that's been building up for the last 20 years.
What about his intelligence? I mean, how did he so miscalculate this? Because I know that, he was visited by officials from the US, from France, from Germany, or at least his team was there in Moscow. And, he was warned, and yet he proceeded with this anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we can only speculate as to why and what his intelligence capabilities are. But I mean, they obviously have a significant intelligence apparatus. Still, in these type of dictatorships where you have a very isolated individual, tend to receive information that his lieutenants and think he wants to hear. And that's probably one part of the problem. I think also arrogance, the fact also that he could operate with impunity. No one has really objected to his proxy involvement in Syria and Libya, made him think that Ukraine would be a pushover.
Mm-hmm. Right. And don't forget, I mean, Crimea, we didn't see anything like this, right? With Crimea.
Exactly.
He was able to go in and do that pretty swiftly. You mentioned Syria, you mentioned Libya. I mean, some of this stuff gets really complicated, right? Or even I think about Iran and the fact that as this was all coming down, we were still working with the Russians to negotiate with Iran. And I start questioning, how murky it all gets, right? So it's so interconnected. I mean, are there reasons that, the international community, maybe they don't have a choice now, right? Given what we have seen coming out over the weekend. Just horrific stuff. So now finally people are saying, okay, like enough is enough. But are there alliances in other parts of the world where, the Western world is working with Russia for some other purpose and it complicates everything?
Yeah, it does. And I think Libya is a good example where the European Union is backing the Tripoli part of Libya. And Russia, Israel, Egypt, and France, to some extent, is backing Haftar in the east, where all the oil and resources and port facilities are. You also have the Emiratis there. So yeah, they are France in that case is freelancing outside of their duty as an EU member to back the Tripoli crowd. It's obviously it's been a public. It got so toxic at some point that Italians and French called home their ambassadors over disputes of how to handle and manage kind of the aftermath of the Libyan crisis. The reason the Israelis and I would say that even the US is divided on Libya. I would say that State Department, the civil servant type of crowd, is backing the Tripoli initiative or government, but I think agencies in the US, intelligence agencies, are actually more interested in backing or supporting Haftar in order to control the Islamist kind of extremist elements, because their calculation and the Israeli calculation seem to be that he is the only one that could keep them at bay. So yeah, there's many dynamics at play at the same time.
But I wonder if this is what sort of breaks all that. I mean, Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan, came out with a letter to shareholders this week where he basically pointed to, how the world was really changing as we know it. And we all hope that this is, going to be okay. But there's the risk that it's not. I mean, it's sort of this domino effect, right? Because Ukraine has kind of changed everything. And I think that some of these countries are going to have to take a position. I mean, China, for example, India even came out and, criticized what was going on. It's once you see this and you know this because you've been investigating these war crimes, but once you see this, it makes it very hard, I think, for the rest of the world to stand by and say, okay, this can be tolerated, because it can't.
Exactly. I mean, You're 100% correct. At the same time, it is tolerated because what we've seen now coming out in these pictures over the weekend and Monday, Tuesday, it's Aleppo light, basically. I mean, and it's Grozny light. It's not gone full blast yet, and I think that's still yet to come. Sadly, I think it's going to get worse before it can get better.
Gosh. And so let me ask you this. I mean, what can the U.S., what can the EU be doing or should be doing? I get frustrated, going back to sanctions for a moment, when I learned that, the sanctions are tougher on Venezuela than they are on Russia, because it seems like a no-brainer. You want to do everything you can in conjunction with the EU. And by the way, let's get as many other players and countries involved as well to put that economic pressure. I realize you're saying it may not change the ground game, but it feels like we got to do something, right? As well as much we can do in the way of weapons support, et cetera. I mean, you can't. We don't want another Aleppo, and I think it's pretty sad that was allowed to happen, as well as Chechnya, and kind of the world just sort of looked the other way. What's different now, do you think?
I think what's different now is that you take a city like Krakow. Krakow and Lviv is 4 hours on a highway from each other if you drive. So suddenly this is happening right next to us. Syria was it was a complicated and complex conflict with lots of tribal and Islamic interests at stake, where the Qataris had their agenda, the Saudis had their agenda, etc., etc. But suddenly here it's completely normal, basically European country, very, very extremely westernized. And you see that from all the interviews on TV. Everybody in Ukraine speaks English. They have a fantastic education system. And suddenly, I think the world, and especially Europeans and the former Eastern states of Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, I mean, all of these countries, Lithuania, Estonia, they have lived with this in the past. They know what they are capable of. And they suddenly realize that, nobody knows where the buck stops right now. But it's different, to be frank with you, now it's white people that looks exactly like you and me and our kids that are getting slaughtered. And it's just, it's basically 4 hours drive away from a major EU and NATO country or a capital city. Historical Krakow is a very important Polish historical city, and which is very much a mirror of Lviv. And
so that resonates more with people because I understand that. In terms of what his ultimate goals are, and you mentioned some of those countries like Lithuania, Romania, being concerned about how far he wants to take this. I mean, Poland's part of NATO, but still they've got to be worried too. What do you think?
I mean, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, I think they're also NATO members. I mean, but he knows that it's impossible to defend them because it's the Baltic Sea, and he has Kaliningrad, and the Baltic, having a naval battle. It's not going to happen. There's no way NATO, and Stoltenberg have said that to himself, it's going to be impossible to kind of defend these countries from a NATO perspective. I don't want to be an alarmist. I don't think he's aiming to take those back, but I think that he firmly wants to have a Black Sea kind of corridor. And he firmly believes that that's, Russian territory, and he wants it back. He feels like it's been stolen from him, and now he wants it back. I don't think this is about positioning NATO weapons too close to his border. That's bullshit. I don't buy that for a second. I think he has long-term geostrategic, interests in this. The same as he did some posturing about, trying to say that he would deploy weapons into Venezuela. I mean, I know the Venezuelans well. I don't believe in that for a split second. I think that's his, unilateral, ventilating, and to scare. And it'd be interesting to see what he does next in terms of, trying to scare the world with what he can do in the Western Hemisphere, which is, 3 hours from Miami.
Well, I mean, look, it's been a big cause of mine always to ensure that we have little Monroe Doctrine in place in the Western Hemisphere, and that we really don't want the Russians hanging out down there in Venezuela or elsewhere, Cuba. And I do think that should be a priority. I want to get to that. But before I do, let me ask you about Putin and whether he continues on. We got to this a little bit in the beginning, but I want to explore it some more because he's got this inner circle that's super, super tight. And, people say, well, why if he's the problem, I mean, is he the problem? Do you think he's entirely the problem, or is it the entire sort of system around him that's the problem? Because if he were to go, what happens next? I mean, would Dmitry Medvedev, say, be a better leader for Russia? And would this all stop? I mean, I guess that's one of the questions that people, keep asking. Like, is it all Putin? And, is there a way for Putin to go to Siberia, shall we say, on a long vacation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no Russia expert per se. I've followed it. I have lived in Russia. I know a little bit about it. But if you look at it, how he has structured it, or rather how he has dismantled all infrastructure around policy making, I would say that, the problem is isolated to him. Because in the past, you would have a Politburo. There would be some institutional friction within the system. That doesn't exist anymore. Everything starts and stops with him, and everybody else is hired to do his bidding or amplify his message. But I mean, I don't think anyone knows what a Russian government actually constitutes. It's him. You have Lavrov, but he's basically a spokesperson, a very loyal one. And then the defense minister is an interesting character who survived all the kind of Kremlin infighting since 91, if I'm not mistaken. So he's obviously a factor into all of this. But ultimately, I think we have to look at this as it's isolated to him, his ambitions to restore Russia to what he perceives is its rightful place in the world.
I mean, that's horrible, though, David. You're talking about one man, right? One man that is destroying so much because of his own, frankly, egotistical ambitions. And, great, right? They're sanctioning his daughters. They still haven't sanctioned him, as far as I know. And I just think, it's horrible if it's really down to one person that's causing all this.
Yeah, and I think the only way to unsettle him would, to try and peel some of his lieutenants off by offering, some type of amnesty or immunity for defecting from Russia. Mm-hmm. If you get Lavrov, someone like Igor Sechin, who I think is more or less a de facto vice president of the country, to defect, keep, a vast majority of their ill-gained assets, etc., etc.
Is it? And he's
in
at
exchange
Rosneft,
for
right?
leaving. Yes.
Yes, he runs maybe Rosneft, you could oil company.
Maybe you could get the tray to shake and have an internal uprising. Because I think we shouldn't underestimate how many people around Putin that has become very comfortable. I mean, not only the oligarchs. You can go a couple of layers under there in their FSB. They have apartments in Marbella or southern France, etc., etc. They might not have super yachts and mansions, but they're used to go to vacations all over Europe. They have second homes. The kids are not, are getting educated all over Europe and in the US. Mm-hmm. You need to hurt them. Frankly, I mean, it's sad to say, but yeah, you going after kids and wives and family and extended family, it's probably more efficient than sanctioning his daughter and him. I mean, I can't really see that has any impact on anything. And then, again, as you say, there's so many ways to circumnavigate sanctions. So, so it's tricky to get an immediate effect. I think if you want an immediate effect, you need to start floating some kind of amnesty program for the top tier of what constitutes his power base in Russia. have to defect basically and leave the country.
Mm-hmm. And that could have some repercussions that would matter. No, that makes sense. You mentioned you think this is going to go on for a while. It's going to get worse before it gets better. What kind of realignments do you think might come from this? I mean, does this force, say, China's hand to maybe squash some of its allegiance with Russia and get closer to the Western world? Will it, in your view, cause us to say, okay, we do need to shore up our Western hemisphere because we don't want Russians having influence in places like Venezuela, which, by the way, is culturally probably a lot more similar to us than to Russia? I mean, how does this change the landscape of the world, in your view?
I think it's premature to come out with some kind of hot take that's relevant here. Mm-hmm. I think it's way too early to see. But when it comes to China's relation to all of this, I think that China is extremely savvy diplomatically. So I think they will manage to balance this, keeping in a healthy distance from all of this, in order to not get tainted and stained by this too much. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, because, I think they're focusing on what's closer to home for them and on Africa and all their interests there. And they don't want to jeopardize all of that they have spent, building up. But it's hard to say. They're not going to come in and tell him to stop. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that they are going to, in any significant way, help him either.
Can the world put pressure on China, though, to, we, again, getting back to sanctions and economic trade?
The question is, do we need China more than China needs us?
Right, that's the question. I mean, I would argue at this point, it could change in time. At this point in time, we actually do have a little bit of the upper hand, only because they haven't developed their domestic economy as much as they'd wanted to. And thus are pretty reliant, right, on us importing all of their stuff. But, I hear you. All of this would be painful. By the way, the sanctions, let's be clear, that are being put on Russia, and the stoppage, which should hopefully happen sooner rather than later, of buying of natural gas from Russia. All of this is painful for everyone. I mean, it's painful for the Europeans, who I think are going to see a ton of inflation as a result of this in energy prices, which filters through to everything else, and could very well be poised for an economic recession as a result. The U.S., if we suddenly said we can't import anything from China, that would have massive consequences. So all of this it's a domino effect.
And I think it's time for the world to start thinking in more pragmatic terms and when they look at adversaries and make judgments. Who is a real adversary and who are we punishing for political reasons, actually, without constituting any actual threat to the world. So, going back to Venezuela and Cuba, do they pose a threat to anyone? Not really. Cubans make fantastic cigars. It's a small, tiny island. They have been designated a state sponsor of terrorism. The notion that, that I think that's a bit of a stretch, to put it mildly. That's something that should be lifted so
even
that women can go back. Even despite the Havana
syndrome? Remember, there's a lot of U.S. State Department employees who came down with Havana syndrome originally in Cuba. Although I think people don't know it's necessarily the Cubans that did it, but there are questions about it.
No, of course. But the notion that they would pose a threat to some neighboring island or country's existence, or that they would carry out terrorist attacks in other places is just, it's a bit of a stretch. And the same goes for Venezuela. The Venezuelans might not, do everything, as we want them to do it. And I think they're working hard on aligning their, economic interests with the U.S. And fundamentally, most Venezuelans that I know and the government officials that I am interacting with, they're very keen to reset relations with the U.S. They want to be a trading partner to the U.S. They don't like China, Russia, India, Iran, and others that they have been forced to do business with. Mm-hmm. And from an economic point of view, Wall Street and the US has a massive interest in resetting their relations with Venezuela. First of all, because it's a couple of hours away. Secondly, because you have refineries that could take Venezuelan crude. And so does Europe. In Sweden, there is a refinery called Nynäs that is custom built to take Venezuela PDVSA crude that could offset some of these dependencies that are very unhealthy, that we finally now see that we can't just rely on Russia. So we need to start looking at who's the real enemy, who's the real bad guy, and reset some of these, old school type of policies that has out.
They've kind of outlived themselves, right? I mean, this kind of crystallizes everything. I think this is sort of the wake up call. I've been saying this. The Ukraine is the wake up call to the threat that Russia really is. And to your point, we knew about it, and I know you did work in Syria. You saw it. We knew about this, and we yet allowed him to effectively, continue building up all that he's built. And so, I think that this is perhaps the final straw, though, that things do need to change, and we need to rethink how we align ourselves and don't align ourselves. So, I just hope that it resolves itself, soon. I guess that's the one discouraging thing in all this, that it's probably not going to.
No, I think that's very, that's to be overly optimistic. First of all, because the talks aren't really yielding any significant results. I'm not even sure that the right people are in the talks. Mm-hmm. If you look at who's head of the Russian delegation, it's someone that is a history, I think he's a history professor or something. He's a former minister of education or culture or something, who's just been, peddling Putin's view of Russia's place in the world. I mean, if Igor Sechin was head of the delegation, or Lavrov or something like that, then maybe I would take those talks a little bit more serious. I think Turkey is doing a fantastic job in keeping this going. But at the same time, you also need to be critical about it and say, how much is this stalling for time to regroup, resupply, reload, and make a significant push down in Donbass, Donetsk, and secure Mariupol, and maybe advance towards Odessa? I mean,
why do you think it happened now? What is it that changed in the world that made him think this was the opportunity? If you listen to the previous president, he'd say it's because I'm not there. But I think it's a heck of a lot more complicated than that. In fact, I actually blame numerous administrations going perhaps all the way back to George Bush, because if you go all the way back to, when Putin was first in power, we miscalculated this. I think our intelligence community knew what he was capable of, and I'd certainly heard a lot of things over the years, but nobody really thought it was going to happen, certainly to a Western country like Ukraine. But why did it happen now?
Again, you can only speculate, but if you look at it from a European perspective, and I'm Swedish, so I look at it from a European angle. You have presidential elections in France happening right now. You have a new administration in Germany, who is a socialist kind of administration, and I think his calculation was that they will never change their policy, and they are really the country that has made the biggest quantum leap in terms of changing their foreign policy and defense policy, starting to arm themselves again. So I think he saw an opportunity in a Europe where France would be weak going into presidential election. Germany would be inexperienced, and those are the two power epicenters of Europe. UK with Boris Johnson and Brexit, they have so much on their plate already. So maybe he just played it opportunistically and didn't see that this would, strengthen everybody's willing to go against him. And I think he betted on the divide. And frankly, seeing what Germany has done in the last couple of weeks is mind-boggling if you look historically.
It sure is. Yeah, but it shows you what, it shows you when people are up against it, what they're willing to do. And I think Europe is up against it right now. The U.S. is horrified by everything that's happened, and the world can't sit by. Well, we're coming up on time, David, but I so appreciate you joining, and I know how much the listeners will love hearing your information. We hope you come back. We've been talking, of course, with David Falt from Preventive Diplomacy. David, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trish. It's been my pleasure.
Again, my thanks to David Falt from Preventive Diplomacy for an in-depth look at what's really going on behind the scenes. Just a quick reminder, everybody, make sure that you are downloading this podcast and you are subscribed to this podcast on Apple iTunes and on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you do me that favor. Do go to trishintel.com, TRISHINTEL.com as well for more news and information from my entire team right there on my website. And you can correspond directly with me on Locals. I'm on Locals now, trishregan.locals.com. I'll see you back here tomorrow.